Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 13 of Days Gone By, the review series for Gran Turismo's pretty broad and kind of eclectic mix of classic and vintage cars. And in this particular pick we are featuring one of the relatively few classics in the game to be turbo aspirated as standard, and it is of course the BMW 2002 Turbo, powered by a 2-litre turbo engine. It's relatively compact, rear-wheel drive as most BMWs are, and like BMWs old and new, it's known for being a fun car to drive, a good driver's car, and the kind of car which many people have always been fans of in the similar way to cars like the Delta or the 190 Evo or the E30 M3. It's just one of those performance car icons. Now this car is reasonably well priced. It's not amazingly well priced, but at 56 grand or just under 57 grand, it's certainly not too expensive. For a classic especially. It's a non-premium of course, so you don't get the detailed interior, but in terms of spec and performance and its competitive nature, what can you expect from this car if you don't own one yet? Well, the power isn't huge. Although it is turbo aspirated, it's still a classic engine, not a particularly large engine, and not a particularly large car, so you don't necessarily want an insane amount of power going through those tiny back wheels. It does, however, have more than enough power to get the job done. Almost the kind of power you'd get, in fact, from an E92 M3. 403 horsepower, fully tuned, is certainly not bad at all for this car. It also puts out 336 foot-pounds of torque, and in a car that only weighs 903 kilos, with the Stage 3 weight loss package and the window and bonnet weight reduction, that's a pretty good power-to-weight ratio per tonne. Per tonne, in fact, it puts out just under 450 horsepower. So the potential of this car to be a point-to-point missile is pretty good. It's compact, it's a sports performance vehicle anyway, it's turbo aspirated, and it's light. So combine all that with decent power and decent torque, and you could potentially have yourself a pretty brilliant little performance gem. In real life, of course, this car is known as such, but in the world of Gran Turismo, that's no guarantee that a car will necessarily be good. So, is it any good? Well, first of all, let's discuss handling, because it's a classic, it's rear-wheel drive, and it's putting a reasonably high amount of power through a lightweight chassis. So there is potential there for it to be quite twitchy, maybe tail-happy even, because of being light and rear-wheel drive. So, can it handle the power? Well, this is one of those cars that needs to be set up very, very carefully. It's down to the driver, of course, your personal driving style. The track is very important also. But in general, I wouldn't really recommend racing this car. You can drive it for fun, of course, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend racing it in its fully tuned form. And that's for two reasons. For one thing, the PP is quite high, 517 fully tuned, but at the same time you can understand why. It's got decent power and it's lightweight. You put those things together on Gran Turismo and your PP is usually going to be quite high. The problem is it's not really fast enough to be competitive at that level. It's fast enough around corners, but not on the straights, especially not top end. The main issue though, because that's down to the driver really, the main issue would be that it can't really cope with that power. Now it can take a corner, of course, it's not undrivable by any means, but it's too playful. The car wants to get sideways, it wants to throw the back end out at the drop of a hat, it wants to be driven in a fun manner. It's just not ready to race, it's more ready to drift and have fun and maybe even take off-road and throw it all over the place. The car wants to be driven in a crazy way. It's not a sensible car by any means. It's actually kind of similar to a hot hatch in that regard, it just happens to be a small coupe instead. What I would recommend doing though, if you do plan on racing it, is taking the power down. Because if you keep the power down to allow it to say 475 pp, 450, even 425, somewhere around that kind of region, the power will be much easier for the car to cope with. If you keep it down to say 300 horsepower or even less would be better, the car will turn into an incredible cornering machine. Give it just enough power for it to be fast enough, but focus on using the advantages that it already has. Ultra low weight and very compact size. If you use those things primarily rather than relying on straight line performance, it will serve you really well. But, as I said, if you take the power higher, not to say that you shouldn't ever do that, but if you do, be prepared for the fact that it will try to constantly drift. You can wring that kind of characteristic out of the car to some degree using the diff, using camber, etc., but it's always there to a degree. And there are some vehicles which are like that. No matter what you do to them, they are always playful in that regard. Stuff like the Stratos, the Cobra, the Elise. That's just a part of the car's character. So in the case of this car, I would recommend it more for someone who's just looking for fun, really. Something that's fun to drive, something that's a great cruising car for online lobbies. Something when you just fancy taking out a car and having some fun with it. If you do plan to race it, as I said, I would recommend sticking to lower PP levels to use the advantages that it does have. And if you do fully tune it, just be careful of the handling, because it's not bad, it's just a bit skittish, a bit playful, and kind of like driving a hyperactive dog in some ways. But overall, that's it for this particular episode. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.